What would you do if you saw a simply dressed woman step into the first-class cabin of a luxury airline? Some people scoffed, a few whispered sarcastic remarks, and the chief flight attendant walked up, blocking her path with a look of disdain and words as sharp as a blade. "Ma'am, this area is reserved for first-class passengers." What they didn't know was that the woman not only held a first-class ticket, she was the wife of the man who owned the entire airline. And just minutes later, the cabin doors swung open, and the most powerful man in the aviation industry stepped on board. A story about snap judgments, a dramatic shift in power, and a costly lesson for those who are used to judging others by appearance. Don't look away. The truth will surprise you more than you think. On a luxury flight from New York to Milan aboard Aurelia Airlines, the first-class cabin shimmered under soft golden lighting, with spacious leather seats and the quiet roll of premium luggage across thick carpet. Everything exuded exclusivity, refinement, and a touch of quiet judgment. Elena Dawson, 36, stepped into the cabin. She wore a simple beige knit dress, her hair neatly tied back, minimal makeup, and a modest old watch, a gift from her husband. In her hand was a first-class boarding pass, booked personally by that very husband. Nathaniel Blake, a powerful entrepreneur and major shareholder of Aurelia Airlines. Nathaniel had wanted to surprise her with this gift after years of her quietly stepping back from the spotlight to care for their family. He was tied up with business and would join her later in Milan. Elena, once a flight attendant herself, still carried the poise and grace of service, though today she was not working. She was a guest. She walked calmly towards seat 1A, but just as her hand touched the armrest, a cold voice rang out behind her. "Excuse me, miss. First class isn't open to misplaced passengers." Victoria Hale, the lead flight attendant, stood there, impeccably made up, her hair pinned in a sleek chignon, uniform tailored to perfection in deep navy and gold trim. But nothing stood out more than the icy sharpness in her gaze and the arrogance in her posture. Elena turned around politely. "I believe you're mistaken. This is my seat." She presented her e-ticket on her phone. Victoria glanced at it, not bothering to touch it. "I don't think you understand. This is first class. Passenger lists here are strictly pre-approved. Perhaps you'd like to check the seats further back." It was an insult, thinly veiled in professional tone. A middle-aged man nearby raised an eyebrow and shook his head subtly. A woman in oversized sunglasses whispered, "Another one who thinks dressing down makes her invisible." Eleanor stood still for a few seconds. She could have told the truth, that she was Nathaniel Blake's wife, that her ticket was booked directly through the executive office. But she chose not to. "I just want to sit in the seat I reserved." Her voice calm, but her eyes now sharper. Victoria narrowed her eyes, not hiding her contempt. She turned to another attendant and said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "Call ground staff. Looks like we've got another deliberate misunderstanding." Eleanor sat down in seat 1A. She no longer intended to yield. She had once served hundreds of passengers in this very cabin. But never had she seen eyes like these, scrutinizing, condescending, and cold. And none of them knew that in just a few minutes the most powerful man in Aurelia Airlines would board this plane and turn the entire situation upside down. The atmosphere in Aurelia Airlines' first-class cabin had turned ice cold. Some passengers began shooting Elena disapproving glances. Others pretended to be engrossed in their magazines, though their ears were clearly tuned into the confrontation. Victoria Hale, her face still blank, tapped her manicured nails on her handheld tablet. She looked at Elena as if dealing with a disruptive incident. "We're verifying your information, but you should understand. Occupying the wrong cabin is a violation of safety protocols," she said, her voice even, but as cold as a blade. Elena remained composed, but inside fury surged. She had once been a flight attendant. She knew exactly what Victoria was doing, applying pressure to force her out of the seat. A man nearby, wearing a Rolex, smirked. Every day there's someone else who thinks they're entitled to a place they don't belong. A middle-aged woman whispered to her friend. She says her husband bought her a first-class ticket. Probably the CEO of her imagination. A few chuckles rippled through the cabin, like needles piercing Eleanor's dignity. But Victoria wasn't done. She turned to a junior flight attendant and said, deliberately louder than necessary, "Call internal security. I don't want an unidentified passenger in this section until we verify her credentials." Elena raised her head. Her tone was calm, but her eyes now blazed with fire. "My name is Elena Dawson, and I'm sitting in the seat that was purchased for me, with all proper documentation. If you'd like to call security, I'm happy to stay and cooperate." Victoria arched a brow, as if this defiance annoyed her more than surprised her. She stepped closer, voice low but sharp as a knife. "I've seen plenty like you, dressed modestly, armed with stories about being someone's wife or claiming their husband's a shareholder or insisting they have a first-class ticket. Trust me, I know the difference between the real thing and a borrowed name." A jolt of pain twisted in Elena's chest. She had promised herself she'd stay composed, but that comment, laced with contempt, belittling and deeply insulting, had crossed the line. She clenched her fist slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line, but before she could respond, the sound of the aircraft's front door opening echoed. The unmistakable rhythm of leather shoes striking the cabin floor rang out, slow, steady, and commanding. Silence blanketed the entire first-class cabin. Some passengers immediately recognized the man who had just stepped in. Grey Brioni coat, tall frame, a stride exuding unshakable authority, a face of stone, eyes sharp as blades. Nathaniel Blake, Elena's husband, and the largest shareholder of the very airline they were flying on. And the first place his eyes landed was on Victoria Hale, the chief flight attendant, now standing squarely between his wife and her rightful first-class seat. Nathaniel walked forward, each step slicing through the artificial pride thick in the air. He didn't need to raise his voice. His silence was more terrifying than 100 threats. And Victoria, still in her crisp, regulation-perfect uniform, could only stand there, frozen, speechless. Nathaniel Blake came to a stop at the center of the first-class cabin. His gaze was calm, deliberate, yet each passing glance from him seemed to tighten the air so much that a few passengers instinctively held their breath. He locked eyes with Victoria Hale, and his voice, though low, cut through the cabin like a blade. "What exactly is happening here?" He didn't raise his voice, but everyone heard him. Victoria stiffened, forcing a professional smile that barely held. "Mr. Blake, good evening. We're just handling a small misunderstanding. A passenger may have accidentally taken the wrong seat." Nathaniel didn't even turn his head. He simply lifted one hand and slowly pointed towards seat 1A, where Eleanor still sat, upright, composed, and quiet. "Her?" he asked. Victoria swallowed hard. Her lips trembled slightly. "Yes, I believe this woman may have been in the wrong cabin, but we hadn't confirmed yet, so I was just following protocol." Then Nathaniel turned. This time he looked Victoria directly in the eye, not with anger, not with shouting, but with a cold, unwavering stare that sent a chill straight down her spine. "Allow me to confirm for you," he said, and walked over to Elena's seat. He bent down slightly, gently placed his hand on her shoulder, and whispered softly enough for only her to hear. "I'm sorry. I should have been here sooner." Eleanor looked up at him and smiled gently, not a single word of blame. Then, in front of a now stunned cabin, Nathaniel stood tall and said clearly, "Allow me to introduce my wife, Elena Dawson Blake." The one person I trust enough to occupy this first-class seat, booked in her name with my credentials and my account, as the largest shareholder of Aurelia Airlines." The words landed like a silent earthquake. No yelling, no theatrics, just quiet devastation of all arrogance in the room. Victoria instinctively stepped back. Her face had gone pale. Passengers around them started whispering. The man who had scoffed earlier folded his magazine and stared out the window in silence. The woman with the diamond ring who had sneered now looked down and fumbled in her handbag, pretending to search for something. And Victoria? She tried to stammer out some sort of explanation. I sincerely apologize, Mr. Blake. We didn't know. She was who? Nathaniel cut in, voice like frost. A woman not wearing designer brands, not dripping in jewelry, not accompanied by a man, so you assumed she must be an imposter. Silence. If you can't distinguish real class from cheap assumptions, then I'd say you've been sitting in the wrong position since the first day you put on that uniform. Victoria stood frozen. Then Nathaniel turned to the flight manager, who had been quietly bowing from a few paces away, and said coolly, "I want a full report on this incident, on my desk, within 2 hours." Then he turned back to Eleanor, offering her his hand. "Take your seat, darling. This flight should only begin when everything is finally in its rightful place." Eleanor sat down, and this time, no one dared say a word. The flight had finally taken off, but no one in the first-class cabin was enjoying their champagne or watching the latest movies. The air hung heavy, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for a verdict. Victoria Hale stood at the back of the cabin, her face pale, her lipstick long faded, eyes darting around in panic. She tried to maintain composure, but her hands clutched her clipboard tightly, as if it were the last thing tethering her to her job. The flight supervisor had quietly retreated to a side room, phone in hand, having just sent a message to corporate, per Nathaniel Blake's direct instruction. In seat 1A, Elena Dawson rested her head lightly against the window, eyes drifting across the clouds. She hadn't spoken a word since she sat down. She didn't look angry, nor smug. And somehow that silence was more haunting than any outburst could have been. Eventually, Victoria walked down the aisle, no longer the proud, polished chief flight attendant, but a woman clinging desperately to the last thread of control. She stopped in front of Elena, bowed slightly, voice trembling. "Mrs. Blake, I sincerely apologize for the way I treated you earlier." Elena didn't look at her. Her gaze remained fixed on the sky outside. Victoria continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong. Completely wrong. Please tell Mr. Blake. I was just following protocol. I didn't mean any harm." At that, Eleanor finally turned her head. Her expression was calm, but her words cut sharper than any scolding. "You didn't mean to question a paying passenger. You didn't mean to humiliate someone in front of a crowd." Victoria looked down. Her eyes were red and her hands shook slightly. I made assumptions. I was careless. Please, Mrs. Blake, I'm asking for a second chance." Eleanor didn't flinch. She gently set her glass of orange juice down, then spoke, quietly, but loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "We don't need someone who knows how to pour champagne. We need someone who knows how to treat people with dignity, even when you think no one's watching." The words hit like a blade, quiet but final, severing any remaining threads of justification Victoria might have hoped to use. She stood motionless for a long moment, then slowly turned, walking back on unsteady legs, the stares of every passenger burning into her back. Across the aisle, the woman with the sapphire necklace, who had chuckled earlier, now pulled her coat up over the jewelry. The man who'd been reading folded his magazine and stared into nothing. No one said a word. Eleanor turned to Nathaniel, tilting her head. "You think they've learned something yet?" Nathaniel smiled faintly, eyes glinting. If not, they'll have plenty more chances. But some people won't be getting back up again. And at the rear of the cabin, Victoria, once the poised and proud face of the first-class experience, now sat slumped in an empty seat near the service door, as if awaiting a final sentence. Less than 10 minutes after the plane reached cruising altitude, the cabin speakers crackled, not with the captain's voice, but with a deep, commanding tone. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Nathaniel Blake, chairman of the board and principal shareholder of Aurelia Airlines. The entire first-class cabin fell into dead silence. Someone dropped a glass of champagne. The man who had earlier complained about the stranger instinctively tightened his tie, while the woman with the sapphire necklace shrank deeper into her seat, as if trying to disappear. Nathaniel continued. His voice wasn't loud, but every word landed like a hammer. I have observed everything that took place earlier with Mrs. Elena Dawson, my wife, and also a former chief flight attendant with many years of distinguished service in this industry. All eyes turned to Elena, who now sat quietly, her face calm, as though everything that had happened was simply the natural course of justice. We appreciate your patience during the resolution of this incident, but I must now make a formal announcement. Nathaniel paused. Inside the cabin, even heartbeats seemed to hold. As of this moment, Victoria Hale, chief flight attendant on this flight, is officially suspended for gross misconduct and discriminatory treatment of a passenger. A wave of murmurs swept through the cabin like wildfire through dry brush. Faces that had once ignored or mocked Elena now turned toward Victoria, some in shock, others in quiet satisfaction. At the rear of the cabin, Victoria stood frozen, still clutching her clipboard, but her eyes were now clouded with tears. Nathaniel went on, his voice no longer cold, but deliberate, weighty. We do not tolerate any form of prejudice, whether it be based on appearance, clothing, or social status. An airline does not merely carry passengers, it carries human dignity. From the last row of the cabin, a single clap rang out, tentative at first, then another, and another, until a full round of applause spread across the luxurious space, transforming the very air they breathed. Elena remained silent, but in her eyes there was a quiet light. Not triumph, not revenge, just the steady glow of justice finally landing where it belonged. Victoria collapsed onto the nearest jump seat. A young flight attendant approached her as if to speak, then hesitated and stepped back. They looked at her, the woman who once commanded them like an untouchable superior, now reduced to someone who had lost everything, all because of a single misjudging glance. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, a living lesson on human decency, dignity, and the steep price of arrogance. The plane began its descent, preparing for landing. Victoria Hale, once icy and authoritative, now sat hunched in an empty crew seat near the galley. Her uniform no longer symbolized authority, only the weight of a mistake that could not be undone. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady. After several moments of hesitation, Victoria stepped toward Nathaniel and Elena. "Mr. Blake, Mrs. Dawson." Her voice trembled. I'm truly sorry." Eleanor turned to look at her, eyes calm but not distant. Nathaniel said nothing. Victoria swallowed hard, as if every word that followed tore painfully from her throat. "I behaved terribly. I know I was wrong. But I've worked for this airline for over 12 years and have never had an incident like this before." She bowed her head low, her voice cracking. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, only for a chance to make things right. I'll accept a demotion, a transfer. Just please don't let me lose everything." The cabin was still, passengers nearby could hear every word, and the soft, broken sobs that followed. Eleanor glanced at Nathaniel as if inviting him to speak, but she was the one who responded first, gently yet clearly. If I were just another passenger, without the name Blake attached, would this apology ever have happened? Victoria froze. Eleanor continued, her voice void of bitterness, only truth laid bare. I was once a flight attendant. I understand the pressure. I understand how demanding this job can be. But the very first thing we're taught is to treat every passenger with respect. You forgot that. Not by accident, but because you thought you had the power to choose who deserved it. Victoria dared not raise her eyes. Any defense she might have had dissolved under the weight of what she had already done. Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice low but resolute. Unfortunately, this is no longer just an internal matter. This is a lesson, and sometimes lessons must come at a cost. He did not raise his voice. He did not show anger, but the look in his eyes made it clear the final door had just closed. Victoria stepped back slowly, tears rolling down her cheeks. The pride she once carried had vanished, and in that moment every gaze in the cabin turned away, not out of cruelty, but because they all understood. It was simply too late. Elena gently placed her hand on Nathaniel's wrist, a small gesture, but one that ended the conversation completely. No more words were needed. The plane began its descent into the island of St. Lucia, golden tropical sunlight streaming through the windows like a quiet signal that a new chapter was about to begin. But inside the first-class cabin of Aurelia Airlines, no one dared lift their gaze toward the woman in the jade-green dress, seated silently in 1A. Elena Dawson hadn't spoken a word for the remainder of the flight. She simply leaned back, eyes gently closed. Beside her, Nathaniel Blake held her hand loosely, not needing to speak. His presence alone was enough. The flight attendants moved about with an uncommon quietness. Eleanor's half-finished glass of wine was replaced without a word. A soft towel was brought just for her. Victoria Hale, after being summoned to the service cabin, never returned. There were no loud voices, no words of blame. Only one undeniable truth now hovered over the entire cabin. Eleanor Dawson, once judged for her modest appearance, was the wife of the airline's largest shareholder, and she had always deserved respect. When the plane finally came to a full stop on the runway, a senior company representative stood waiting at the front of the cabin. He bowed slightly, forehead damp with sweat. "Mrs. Dawson, Mr. Blake, we've received the full report. On behalf of the entire airline, please accept our sincerest apologies. The matter will be addressed with the utmost seriousness." Nathaniel didn't shake his hand, just gave a polite nod. Eleanor rose, slowly gathering her small, neat carry-on. Before stepping out of the cabin, she paused and turned back to look at the first-class aisle, a space that had once been filled with judgmental stares, whispered mockery, and polite scorn. Now it was silent. Then, like a quiet punctuation mark of grace and pride, Elena spoke one final line. "Next time, don't judge a woman by the price of the dress she wears." She stepped off the plane first, back straight, chin lifted. Behind her, many bowed their heads. Some, like the man with gold cufflinks and the elderly lady with the sapphire pendant, whispered quietly to one another, "I think we just learned an expensive lesson." And they were right, because on that flight only one woman had been mistreated, but everyone had been taught a lesson in dignity. 2 days later, at the Manhattan headquarters of Aurelia Airlines, the tension in the executive boardroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Victoria Hale, once the proudest chief flight attendant on the team, now sat across from 3 senior directors. Her uniform was no longer pristine, her once sharp gaze now dulled. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to maintain her composure. One of the board members finally spoke. "We've reviewed the full cabin footage. Ms. Hale, Your handling of passenger Elena Dawson was a serious violation of service protocol and professional ethics. Victoria clenched her fists, voice hoarse. I didn't know she was Mr. Blake's wife. I thought she was just... She was cut off by a director, voice colder than steel. Exactly, you thought. And because of that, you've lost everything. A folder was slid across the table toward her. Inside, the termination letter, already signed by the board. Victoria went still. Her eyes fell on her own name, bold at the top of the page, and for the first time it looked painfully small. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know I was wrong. If there's any way, I'd take any position, just please." No one answered, and Victoria understood. Her time was over. Meanwhile, at a luxury resort on the sunlit shores of St. Lucia, Eleanor sat in a balcony armchair, the golden hues of sunset resting gently on her shoulders. Nathaniel approached, a small box in hand. "I was saving this for our anniversary," he said with a soft smile, "but I think now might be the better moment." Eleanor opened the box. Inside was a sleek new employee ID, her name etched in silver. Elena Dawson, Director of Customer Experience, Aurelia Airlines. She looked up, stunned. "You're putting me back in the skies." Nathaniel chuckled, eyes warm. "Not quite. I'm handing this airline to the only person I trust to change its culture. With kindness, not power." Eleanor turned toward the sea, her heart light. She had never needed a title to prove her worth. But now that she had one, it was because she had earned it. In a world where glamour often overshadows true values, sometimes a single condescending glance can spark the most unforgettable lesson. Elena Dawson never needed to prove her status. Her dignity alone was enough to make an entire first-class cabin bow its head. Thank you for watching until the very end. If you believe that kindness and respect should never depend on appearances, subscribe to our channel to continue sharing stories that inspire and uplift. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that true worth isn't worn on the outside. It's shown in how we treat others. We'll see you in the next story, where compassion is always the final answer.